It's been said that Mother's Day sermons are always about, say, Proverbs 31, or like I did, Hannah. And they focus on a lot of just the wonderfulness of being a mom. Moms, you're great. Moms, we're so thankful for the sacrifices that you've made. Some of you also have to put up with knucklehead husbands, right? We do this with happiness and joy. And then, when it comes to Father's Day, the joke I read says, the Father's Day message is pretty much always the same. Men, be tough. And it's getting weirder out there, so be tougher. And there's some truth in that. And that's why I was intent on just going through and doing Matthew 18. I don't really like doing holiday-based messages. We typically do chapter by chapter, verse by verse here. And yet, once again, some things happened throughout the week. Had to pray about it, and at about 2 o'clock yesterday, I completely had to change what I intended to do for the message. And I want you to know how that happened, and then we're eventually going to get to Genesis 14. So you can go ahead and turn there. And although I'm going to be talking to the men a lot today, ladies, this also applies to you to help you understand your sons, to help you understand your husbands, your own dads, because even though society seems to have forgotten this, men and women were made differently. Men and women have different purposes inside the home, different tendencies. Yes, there's absolutely some range there. We can find some tough women like Gina Carano, who's in the Star Wars a while back in the Mandalorian show, who could totally kick my rear, right? A tough lady. But then we also find guys like me who, for a little bit, was a stay-at-home dad. We see a range in that, and that's okay. In temperament and in skill, but at the end of the day, it's not just plumbing, it is on a chemical level in every cell in our body, in our brain chemistry, men and women are different, and we're going to look at that a little bit today, because as I saw Father's Day approaching, I heard a couple of things, and our world is struggling with this right now, and we need that truth from Scripture. And one of the turning points this week was when I heard a quote from this guy. Most of you know who this is. This is Chris Pratt. He was actually being interviewed about a show on Amazon Prime that came out last year called The Terminal List. Some of you know him as Peter Quill in the MCU or the Marvel superhero movies. My son might know him best as the voice of Emmett from the Lego Movie, one of his favorites. And so however you know this guy, he happens to be a Christian. And I'm not saying that he is the best example ever, or that he is perfect, or that he is a pastor, or anything like that, but he is a Christian in Hollywood who is sincere about his faith, and that has gotten him attacked quite a few times. He's also sincere about being a dad. Terminal List is one of those shows or movies or stories that we keep telling ourselves, even as the culture tries to shift and move away and tell different messages. We keep retelling the story of the hero dad who comes in to protect, defend, or avenge his family. You know, in the 80s, it was Commando. A few years ago, it was Taken. We keep retelling this story, but actually there's a story very much like that inside of Scripture that we're going to look at today. And there is this desire to protect our family that is very godly, that is built into men. Chris Pratt said that being a dad helped him prepare for this role because he would avenge, in the show, his little daughter, whose name was Lucy. Now, I believe it was the comedian Dennis Galaxia, and some of us got to hear him at the Laugh for Life kind of fundraising banquet, both this year and last year, who had said, and maybe somebody else had said this as well, when my son was born, I looked at him, and I knew that I would die for this little boy. But when my daughter was born, I looked at her, held her in my arms, and I knew I'd kill for this little girl. And there's this urge, this fierce desire to protect. And there is nothing like it in this world for those of us that are dads. Those moments, that first time you held your baby boy or your baby girl. You know, especially if you're not just like a biological father. If you're a dad, you know, life has changed. It's not about me anymore. It's about protecting them. Oh, it's a beautiful moment. And we hear these verses in Scripture. Those of us that are following Christ, we know, we hear that we are to train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, we will not depart from it, or he will not depart from it. And we hear these things. And for those of us that are younger, it's an encouragement to raise our children appropriately, to teach them Scripture, to go and talk about God no matter what we are doing, to find a way. Deuteronomy 6 goes into this, whether we're in the fields, whether we're at home, whatever we are doing, find a way to train our children, look for those teachable moments, and connect them with God, connect them with truth. And yet, anytime I read that verse, I also know I encounter people who have had that verse said to them and don't understand the nature of a proverb and what it's supposed to do. And sometimes they look later on in life and their kids have gone squirrely. Like I mentioned last week, remember, God isn't done with them yet. If you have in your family division and you have individuals that have departed from God, maybe, right, they're a prodigal and they'll come back. The same Bible that contains this passage also contains the story of the prodigal son. But just your first takeaway, your first application, even write this down if it helps you understand how a proverb works. A proverb is a general statement meant to encourage a behavior, not an ironclad promise. Unfortunately, I've encountered many people who have had this verse, instead of being an encouragement, feel like it's a bludgeon as they look at their child kind of currently floundering and they feel guilty. The reality is we have free will, and our kids can and do sometimes go a little squirrely. But keep praying and don't give up. But back to Chris Pratt, back to the terminal list. It's a story that we keep telling, and he says that as he thought about this character, this was an interview in Men's Journal, he was realizing some of his own feelings that he had as a dad. He says, I think every dad secretly fantasizes about what they would do if someone ever, we'll go with messed with, their kids. Whenever you're put in a position, or even imagine a position where those kids are in danger, your mind goes to wild places. Your partner sees you staring off into the distance and says, honey, what are you thinking about? And you say, oh, nothing. But what you're really thinking is, where's the duct tape and how deep is the trunk? I think that's most dads. Now, some of you may think that sounds really serious, but it is. It really is. But it's also really important, and there's a part of that is God-given to men for us to protect those around us. So men, don't believe what society tells you. Ladies, don't believe what society tells you. Men and women aren't just interchangeable, right? People do need a dad. Little boys and little girls, they behave differently. Many of you guys know I'm at such a depth of being a nerd that I know folks that work at major toy companies. And they tell me they can set kids down in some of these research groups, boys and girls, and they can even give them the same toys and they play differently. I did this with my own kids just to verify what the bigwigs were saying, right? I can give my daughter superheroes, and you know what she's doing? She's building friendships and relationships with them. You give my son those things, he's fighting. Right? He's paddling it out. There's something in there in men that help us prepare to defend. We have this chemical called testosterone, or this hormone, and men have more of it, much more of it than women. And it makes us able to grow muscle faster. It is not sexist, but it is a reality that the standards to enter into military service for ladies are lower than men, because chemically, men can build muscle better than women can. It's just a reality. We behave differently, and in fact, it is unfair to expect the behavior of little girls from the behavior of little boys, and that is not an excuse, right? They also need discipline, but we need to keep that in mind that they are chemically wired differently. Now, our society likes to talk about this concept called toxic masculinity. You've probably heard it a ton, and you know what? Sometimes they have a point. I don't want this to be a blanket defense of everything that men has done, because unfortunately our own culture has had plenty of chauvinism, has plenty of difficulty in inappropriate behavior, and even the Bible calls men to restrain some of our natural tendencies, even as dads. Ephesians 6:4 says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. My son's there, he's like, all right, this is great. But then also it says this, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So we have to be careful about how we parent. And that also goes into the marriage world. I can remember when Heather and I were going to get married. We went to our pastor at the time, Delman Sizemore in Kentucky. And him and his wife, Linda Gale, I had known her all my life. There was some connections to them. And it was a wonderful premarital counseling session. And he actually told us what not to do. And I think some of us learn best both in, hey, that's a great example, but sometimes we need to go, oh, that's bad, and I can even see how it goes wrong. And we go, well, I'm not going to do it that way. He told us the story of a couple that they had encountered. And they'd gone over to their house and they had had a meal together, which is an important thing to do. It's always great to have fellowship or hang out together. We need that friendship. But he noticed that the husband there, he was eating his meal and say the peas, he ran out of peas. If he wanted more, he would just take his fork and he would tap on that side of the plate. And his wife would quietly get up and go get him peas and bring him back and refill the peas. Now, Delman brought this up and he then pivots to Scripture. Is that loving your wife the way Jesus loved the church? No. No, it's not. And so society has a point when they point out things like father wounds, some of these difficulties that we have. And we do need to address that because we don't want toxic masculinity. We want holy masculinity. We want the proper use of those desires that we have. And in fact, as society has really pushed back, society has done what society always tends to do. It overcorrects. It identifies some kind of problem and then attacks wholly in the wrong way. And then we see something quite differently happening now. Now we have a fatherless epidemic going on in our society. The fatherless represent 90% of homeless and runaway children, 85% of children with behavioral disorders, 85% of youth in prison, 75% of children in chemical abuse centers, 80% of rapists, 71% of high school dropouts, 63% of teen suicides, 47% of convicted thrill killers and sex-related murderers. If you are a dad, a granddad, a stepdad, a father figure, a big brother who stepped up, thank you. You are making changes not only in somebody's life, but it has ripple effects across all of society. The most important unit in our culture, in any nation, is the family. And there's a reason dads were called to step up. We need dads, and we need more of them. We need holy masculinity back in our society, or else the chaos is just going to continue to spiral out of control with crime and brokenness. Now, we're going to turn to a passage in Genesis, way early in the Bible, Genesis 14, and it's going to sound a little interesting at first, so let me give you a setup. We're going to read names that are a little hard to pronounce and that we typically don't focus on. These are different kingdoms that are going on in the area, or the era, before Israel becomes a nation. And it's almost going to sound like a Lord of the Rings story as we read through it. But as I was watching another movie yesterday, I was still wrestling with that idea of, I really want to get to Matthew 18. Men have been told they need to toughen up enough. I was watching Extraction 2, and then this is another movie, this one with Chris Hemsworth, and he's rescuing a kid, and ends up being his nephew and his niece. And so we don't know that at first, but there's this father instinct, and even though he had been wounded and injured and nearly killed, he gets back up, he retrains, and he goes on the rescue because he has this family instinct. And then it clicked in my head, there's a Bible story a whole lot like this. And by story, I mean the style of writing. I don't mean fiction. I mean a narrative. There is a Bible account a whole lot like this. And it couldn't leave my head. And so there I am on the exercise bike getting the adrenaline, because I don't know about you guys, but I like to watch something, big and with explosions and violence when I'm on the exercise bike. And that is a very manly thing, right? I try to keep it appropriate, but I do enjoy that. And then as I'm doing that, I'm also going, Lord, what are you doing? I had this plan again for Matthew 18, but oh no, our society is telling the story while at the same time, so much of the news, so much of our culture is trying to shout it down. It's time to spotlight it appropriately and spotlight it biblically. So here's a little setup here. Abram has been called out from the land of Ur, and he is going to become Abraham later. But he has brought with him a nephew named Lot. And Lot, their ownings had grown to the point where they needed to kind of separate. And Lot moves toward this town called Sodom. And yes, it's that Sodom. And then he moves into that town called Sodom. And yes, that's where we get words like sodomite or sodomy. They were known for their sexual sins to the point that before the destruction of their city, there was an attempt at raping angels from some of the men of the town. A story that many of you know. But Abram, what we may not understand as we read this, Abram is meant to be the father of many nations. But even though we know from Hebrews 11 that he is a man of the faith, he's in what we call the hall of faith, he didn't really start out that way. He had enough faith to step out and go as God called, but he didn't have the right amount of faith to obey all along the way. He brought with him his wife, Sarai, who was later called Sarah, and she was also, which was common at the time, a half-sister. When they got into trouble, he's like, oh, that's not my wife, that's my sister. No, wait, buddy, I thought you're a man of faith and you trusted God would get you through. Well, he was building that faith over time. And actually, one of the ways that he showed a kind of, well, I trust God enough to do what he says, but I need to keep a backup plan, is actually Lot. Because in those days, when you had no children, your nephew would sometimes be your heir. So as he's going out, yep, God, I'm going to follow you. You're going to do something. I'm going to be the father of many nations. But just in case you let me down, I'm going to bring Lot. And it actually caused a lot of problems for him. But here Lot is, kind of like some of our loved ones, maybe some of us. Lot should know better, and yet Lot is not living the life he's supposed to be, and he gets caught up in something. So let's read Genesis 14, starting in verse 1. And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom. And that's where we're going to get the connection with Lot. And with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, another place that you should know about. Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. So these were kind of, oh, you're king, but you have to pay a bigger king a bunch of taxes. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Raphaim and Ashroth Canarim and the Zuzim and Ham. And, you could go deeper into what some of these are connected to. And the Emim in Shiva and Kirathim and the Horites and the Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hazan Tamar. And some of these names are going to sound a little more familiar than others. And the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out. And they arrived for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. That's why this is called the War of Kings. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. And this is where it comes into the story. All those kings, not a lot of information about all of them. We don't really typically look at them in terms of study, but the world is going on all around us all the time. And this is a passage that covers real history, real people, and a real place. We can see here some of the movement that we know happened in this instance, how they came across from way over there, how they crossed over from where Babylon is, which is in modern-day Iraq, and where they came into the land that we know as Israel. And this was really before it was that land. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house 318 and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And we can see that pursuit and trace it there. As we zoom in, we can see that Sodom and Gomorrah are near there. And this phrase, from Dan to Beersheba, is sometimes used in the Old Testament to kind of mean all of Israel. So Dan is kind of the northernmost point. But you can see here, Abram isn't alone. He has men under his leadership, and he also has allies. But he responds with that God-given impulse, whether Lot is in the right or not, whether Lot is where he's supposed to be or not, that is his family, and you do not mess with him, you have made war. And he is going to war to protect his family, and he's doing it with his allies. Now, we have some troubling trends in our society, especially with men. There was a study by a group called Equimundo, and they found that a lot of men are feeling isolated. It said this: among the most troubling findings was that a majority of men in all age groups, except those 38 through 45, are lonely and feel isolated. 59% of men between 31 and 37 reported feeling that no one really knows me. And 43% met the standard for depression and reported suicidal ideation, that means they're thinking about it, in the previous 2 weeks. We have an epidemic of depression and isolation among men. Men don't do connection very well. When we worked out in the fields or when we chopped lumber together, when we did things side by side, something physical, men bond over that pretty well. In our Thursday Pastors Zoom group, we talked about this a little bit recently because we talked about this is an ongoing problem. And as a pastor, I still need to go to church. I still need pastors. I still need fellowship. And so I have that. But many men don't, even in the ministry. And that's why they burn out. They try to go it alone. They can't handle it that way for too long. But in a culture where we hear, that man is self-made or self-reliant as a good thing, and we are no longer doing physical things side by side, but are staring at a screen or sitting at a desk more and more, we find that men are not connecting the way that they used to. And so when they don't have those friends, it impacts their health everywhere in every way because we are not meant to do it alone. Loneliness is such a problem that this was on social media, I can't remember, I think this is Facebook. One social media user said this: Jesus' biggest miracle was he had 12 close male friends at the age of 30. Now, it's said with some humor, but it's the truth. A lot of men are very lonely. We make a bond while we're working, and then we don't call and check up on people when they go and do a new job. And so if we move and drift on, we don't have those close relationships. Women tend to, now again, there's some generality, it's kind of on a range, tend to make friends a little easier, a little better, and stay in touch a little more often. But in our society, we often hear about how privileged men are. And we hear about things like a pay gap and things like that. But there are lots of stats that show that these are pros and cons. Men and women are different. And although that pay gap, especially if you factor in vacation or medical leave time, is almost non-existent now, there was certainly a time where we needed some correction with the way our society treated women. But now we have a real issue with men. Did you know that on average men live about 5 years less than women? Men have a higher death rate for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and suicide. 1 in 2 men will develop some kind of cancer, right? And I could keep reading. And then there are more facts about our health, right? Suicide is the biggest killer of men in the United Kingdom, right? But we have similar stats here. 53% of all cancer deaths are men. 12 men in the United Kingdom alone take their own lives every day. They are more likely to lose custody in a divorce, right? They are more likely to suffer all kinds of things, and we are getting fewer college degrees as men. Guys, don't do this on your own. You need allies. You need brothers in arms. As the devil has worked in our society and isolated men from one another, he's picking us off one by one. And unfortunately, it is working. Guys, we always need a mentor or a father figure in our life. We always need somebody that we're pouring into like a Timothy. And we always need somebody kind of by our side on the same level that we can connect with. And you know that the way we learn from men and women is differently. The way we learn from mom and dads are differently. And that kind of carries on. Let me tell you a story that illustrates that and kind of helps us understand the need for both a mom and a dad in a family. My wife would have never done this, but I did this. My son who's sitting over there, he didn't know how to swim when he was at a certain age, and we were at a friend's house after, we were a church friend. I think we maybe even went to church that morning. I can't remember the day. And he was 2 or so. We had swimmies on him, and he did not want to go out to the deep end of the pool. He wanted to just hang on the edge. Now, this is a dad way of teaching and training, and it's important because it challenges the kid. I grabbed him and said, "Son, I've got you." I held him tight, gave him a big bear hug. "I've got you. You're missing out on fun. You need to learn this skill. Come on, there's nothing to be afraid of. I've got you." He is terrified, and we walk. Now, it was deep for him, but it wasn't deep for me. So I stood there and I held him. And he went from tears to, "No, don't make me do this. I'm scared," to, "Hey, this is great." And he didn't want to get out of the pool. It takes dads to challenge us like that. Even as adult men, we need older men, more mature men to speak in our lives and do the same thing on a spiritual level, to help us to go deeper into the pool, even if it makes us a little bit uncomfortable. And if we isolate ourselves from those voices, we won't be able to gain those new skills. Now, Abram had allies, and that was really important. And he had that instinct, that God-given instinct to go and fight for his family. So let's keep reading. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. The rescue was accomplished. There was a lot of war that went on there. Think about it. What did Abram have to do? He had to be able to fight. And as he got older, he was older at this point, he had to be able to lead men to fight. And so, all throughout this is the idea that God gave men the ability to grow more muscle or to fight, not to hurt people, but to protect them from those whom he knew would. God knew that people would rebel and not follow their purpose. But men, you are equipped with certain abilities, certain kind of propensities are more likely to happen with you, or ranges and strengths, so that you can use that to glorify God by protecting your family. Verse 17. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, which Salem means peace. There's a lot more that we could go into here. I would encourage you to read more about this on your own. It is a fascinating, this man in the Old Testament is fascinating. Brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed them and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." He gave him a tenth of all. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Anir, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share." And so it wasn't about the spoils of war. It's not about going and conquering just to get stuff. Abram had this instinct to protect his family, and that was appropriate. Now you might say, well, this is an Old Testament issue, right? That's why we might use the phrase going Old Testament on somebody. But in the Jewish understanding, men weren't to be weak. They were to be meek. That is, power restrained. Many of you know who Jordan Peterson is. He's a famous speaker and author. And I quoted him a while back when he referred to meekness as a sheathed sword. And he warns of what weak men are doing to our society today. Because you can't be meek or have power restrained if you are simply weak. Right? Early Christians wrestled with this as well, this call to be, if possible, at peace with all men. And yet, Even Jesus commanded them to have the kind of swords at a certain point to defend themselves from robbers if need be. It was Jewish law, it was Jewish understanding to protect those that would protect your family if they came into your house. Even to protect those who are taking shelter under your house with your own life in front of theirs if someone would come in to do them harm. And so guys like Augustine, early church fathers, would figure out, how does all this work out? And they would talk about this and write letters back and forth. And I understand it's a little bit difficult, but the bottom line is you are to be tough as men. You are to be able to defend your family. You're not to go out there looking for trouble, but if trouble comes to you, if a monster comes at your family, you are to be ready and able to step in and defend that family. Now, that doesn't always just mean physical strength. It also means skills. I'm from Kentucky. I'm a hillbilly, so I really enjoyed our first two songs today. They had a little bit of a southern twang to them, right? And I appreciated that. I'm a hillbilly by nature, but I was the nerdy among the hillbilly, okay? I don't have the same amount of skills and training in some areas that other hillbillies or rednecks might have. But I can tell you, as much as we depend on modern technology, as much as we depend on all those comforts and the government taking care of us and all these kinds of things, when all things break loose, it's going to be the rednecks that know how to hunt, clean, fish, plant, and farm that everybody is going to be looking at, right? So we need to have a couple of those skills. And when we move past the point of physically defending our family, then we should be moving into the point of passing some of those key skills on and training the next generation. But of course, you are correct that our main battle is not physically. If somebody comes at you, be ready to defend your family. But we are still made for war. Let's look at Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Guys, we are in a spiritual war right now, and we need more men to step up. And frankly, I don't think we're doing it well. Maybe it's because we're isolated. Maybe it's because it's hard. Jordan Peterson warned that many young men, they're fulfilling the male fantasy in movies and in video games and those kinds of things because you don't have to pump iron to be tough. You don't have to learn a skill, you just have to pick up a controller. But we have raised some of our younger generation where it's hard for them in a job interview to even look the interviewer in the eye. We have raised a generation that wants safe spaces when we know realistically while we're here on this earth there is no safe spaces. We need to help them get tougher. And guys, I'm convinced that if we had a bunch of Christian men with holy masculinity, our children would not be butchered in the name of healthcare as they are today. These procedures that mutilate our children and are celebrated. Why are we tolerating it? We need to get moving forward. We need to fight the lies of the enemy because there is a monster coming after your family and coming after all the families of our neighbors. And we need men to stand up. And one of the best ways to be a good father, to be a good husband, to be a man is to regularly, actively praise and serve God. And this isn't just church talk. In her book, and you can pick it up, it's The Toxic War on Masculinity. She says, sociological studies find that committed Christian men make the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And that's not just church talk. That's the result of empirical research. Let's be frank. To protect your kids from lies, you have to know the truth in the first place. And the reality is the dads, as much as we are thankful for you moms, the dads make the biggest lasting impact on a kid with their spiritual health. If a father does not go to church, even if his wife does, only one child in 50 will become a regular worshiper or attender at church. If a father goes regularly, regardless of what the mother does, 2/3 to 3/4 of their children will attend church well into adulthood. Another survey found that if a child is the first person in a household to become a Christian, there is a 3.5% probability that everyone in the household will become a follower. If the mother is the first person in a family to become a Christian, there is a 17% probability everyone in the household will become a Christ follower. However, if the father is first, if the dads lead the way, there is a 93% probability. Man, it touches my heart. Everybody in the household will follow. Why aren't we doing it? And yes, you might say, well, I know these things. I know the things that I need to do. I tell my kids. We had a generation that sent their kids to church and thought that was good enough. The reality is kids may not do what you tell them. If you're a parent, you know that. But you know what they will do? They will do what they see you do. Even in the valley in California, things are changing rapidly. And we are descending into just madness. So it's time to step up, because I know that this quote, a very famous quote, is very true. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Now, you probably already felt that already, and that's why I was resistant to give this particular message today, because I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. You guys are here on Father's Day, where many folks are on vacation. You guys are relaxing. Maybe you're watching this later online. Pray for those around you. And maybe even if you're already in the right direction, there's some things that you know in your mind or on your to-do list. I need to spend more time with my kids. I need to teach them that lesson. I need to have that hard conversation with my son or my brother. I need to have some of these things. And it applies to men and women too. These things that we put off until we get around to it. Well, I have to end today with a dad joke. Here's your round to it. And in fact, that's what you're getting as you go out the door today. My wife and my son, and maybe she'll recruit some others, all men are going to get a round to it to take with them. So in closing, take your God-given manly instincts and join the battle you were meant to fight in. Help us protect our families. Help us defend truth. Join a band of brothers. You're not alone. Help us glorify King Jesus. Come back weekly. We will sharpen our swords together and receive detailed battle plans. And as Paul closes 1 Corinthians 16, in verse 13, he says this, specifically to the men. Be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be men of courage. Be strong.